Since I'm not covering an iconic song for a while, I thought it'd be best to actually play the songs I'm trying to replace in their entirety so you have an idea where I'm coming from. I'm happy to do this until I get a copyright notice, so fingers crossed that I'm able to continue this trend. This music that plays during the opening movie, aptly named Opening Demo, represents a couple of constraints for a replacement immediately. Firstly, as I mentioned in the previous video, this track has very strict timing. Percussion and sound effects are applied at specific intervals tied to scene transitions. Secondly, this piece is originally a significant contrast to the prelude in that the music evokes a feeling of dread, fitting to what we're being shown on screen. Let's start by talking about time. There are two distinct parts to this piece, what I'm choosing to call as dread and hope. Dread is largely rhythmic, characterized by pulsing strings and percussion with a tempo that impressively adds to the negative feelings I get from listening to the piece. While there is movement in regards to a melody, the instruments feel like they exist to only season the air. I really couldn't figure out a better way to explain that, because that's just how it makes me feel. I get the feeling that the entire purpose of this segment is to set the tone for what is being presented on screen. Opening Demo is right at 2 minutes long and is separated into a couple of different phases. For Dread, I want to break it down into sort of 3 scenes, if you will. Scene 1 lasts from the beginning to about the 18-second mark. Scene 2 lasts from around 18 seconds to the 36-second mark. Scene 3 lasts from about 36 seconds to about a minute 20, and is where we start to get a bit more musical, shying away from the atmosphere and texturized sounds used previous. After Dread comes Hope, which plays for about 35 seconds, ending with the all too familiar phrase of the original prelude. It contrasts nicely from Dread by switching instrumentation and at least the feeling of tempo, which leads me on another tangent. When I say feeling of tempo, it's because I consider, whether correctly or not, that tempo is whatever you make of it. If you have quarter notes playing at a tempo of 100, you get something that sounds like this. Now, what happens when you change the tempo to 200? Naturally, the pacing becomes faster, but what if you change the notes being played to half notes instead? You end up with something that sounds exactly the same to the listener. The opposite direction certainly holds true. You can have the original tempo down to an absolute crawl at 50 beats per minute, But by changing the notes to eighths, you are again left with a small segment of music that sounds identical. This only really applies to the listener. If you're looking at sheet music, it probably would only make sense that the music is written in its most coherent form. I'm sure there are some composer sadists out there, at least from what I've seen on Threatening Music Notation Twitter, but I know I'd want music that I write to be presented to performers in the clearest way possible. It wouldn't make sense to notate 16th notes at 25 BPM when I could do quarter notes at 100. Why does this matter? Well, I like talking about tempo because it's neat, but also knowing that tempo can be faked is important when dissecting a song. Take dread, as I like to call it. The closest that I could come up with in trying to gauge a tempo is around 50 to 55 BPM. When tempo starts dipping below around 60, I have a hard time getting a real feel for it. There's actually a really good video by Adam Neely about how slow music can actually be, and if you'd like to nerd out about that topic, the link to that video is in the description. Then take hope. By just going with what I feel, I find myself guessing somewhere in the 120 to 125 range. With this very unscientific information, I'm comfortable concluding that dread isn't just played at halftime. There's actually a tempo change between the two. Realistically, none of this information was specifically needed, I just felt like talking about tempo. Anyway, the challenges to write this piece of music actually make me feel anxious. When there's so little to go off of, so many doors are open, and now I'm left to decide how I'd like to proceed. Do I ignore the time-based composition and instead write something that accomplishes the same vibes as the original? Or do I remain constrained to the time elements in play and compose around scene transitions? Do I opt for more musicality or remain within a similar feeling as the original? I know this is literally song number 2, but I truly cannot express how hard this is in comparison to the prelude, and I wouldn't be surprised if its ambiguity ended up making this one of the hardest of the soundtrack. I suppose there isn't anything left to do but start throwing things and seeing what sticks. The only thing I feel rather certain about is that I'd like to maintain a reference to my prelude much like the original game did. Exploring and utilizing music interchangeably is what excited me most when I began this project, so it'd feel foolish to not take advantage of the first opportunity to do so. The first thing I had to do was determine a tempo to settle on for dread. I wanted a bit of flexibility, so I ended up going with a tempo of 132. This allowed for my musical transitions to fade in and with the scene transitions on a time basis relatively close to the original based on my rough draft. Now it's on to the instruments. I decided to mirror the original by using an orchestra. I've had a ton of fun working with the orchestral sounds, and they'll probably be featured on many more songs for this game. I wanted to establish a rhythm that was rather ambiguous so I wasn't forced into a certain style of writing, but I found out pretty quickly that the nature of this piece locks me in regardless. I'm sure if I were more competent at composing, I'd be able to find a creative way to deal with it, but the answer to that is much farther down the road. Timpanis were chosen to carry this rhythm, but I found that having a beat that's predictable is a good way to make the listener comfortable, something that I'm desperately trying to avoid in my attempts to match my anxiety listening to the original. I ended up on a very strange rhythm, where the timpanis would be played separate from the main melodic instruments in the following pattern of 1, 3, 4, and then the second beat of the second measure. In addition to this, I employed some spiccato cellos to create an additional rhythm that feels the proper amount of chaotic for me, with notes played on 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, meaning that on the first beat of 2, cellos play alone, and on the second beat of 2, timpanis play alone. This feels good to me. This further progresses into a variation that marks a transition from one scene to another by cutting the pattern down to only the first 3 beats with the same cellos but not timpanis on the 2 beat. I added in a bass to provide some of the needed texture in the low end. While it will follow the melodic instruments when they play, a long droning note is being played with the rest of the rhythm. I'd like to say that the process of writing the melody, or lack thereof, created something to talk about, but it really didn't. This isn't really a piece that I feel confident in adjusting too far away from the original, and therefore the structure remains similar. Where there were 2 notes, I made 4, with a little variation the second time around. I added in some bass trombones and French horns to try and work with the bass. Then I employed violas and violins to add some higher registers to these glorified chords. After adding all of my chords, this is where we end up for Dread. Now we need to find a way to escape into Hope cleanly. A harmonic minor felt natural to me and contains the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G sharp, while E harmonic minor is the same aside from a sharp F and D instead of just G. I still don't know enough yet about how these play together, but my reasoning is that when the scales are played at the same time, each note of each scale remains the same distance away from each other. If I just drag the E harmonic scale down to the A harmonic minor scale, every single note is the same. I can't explain what this means musically, but my guess would be that they complement each other and the melodies written in both should be easily transposable from one to the other. I will make the point to say that they are not the same, but just very similar in how they each ascend notes, or I guess that's intervals? If more detail about this is desired, please let me know and I'll try to do more research a little faster than I normally would and talk about it more in the next video. I'm looking for an abrupt change in texture and atmosphere when Hope starts. Instead of the slow, whole notes of the previous section, I'd like to include a quicker pace that includes some upward movement. It may just be me, but when music trends upward, or in pitch generally, it makes me feel a bit happier, so I'm hoping to harness a similar effect in the listener. I started by increasing the tempo to a brisk 185 and decided on using a harp as the instrument of choice. I have no idea what is possible for a human harpist or harper to actually play, but I reasoned that most of them probably have 10 fingers, so as long as I don't use more than 10 notes at a time, someone with really long fingers should be able to play this. Right away, I discovered that both G and G sharp are used in what I'm writing, and that totally destroys any thoughts I had about scales playing nice together. I don't know if this would just be an A minor with G sharp accidentals. That feels weird to say because I'm definitely doing it on purpose. Anyway, the bass line goes a little something like this. Now, the melody has an interesting origin. I initially wrote it for the next track that I'll be covering, but found that it really didn't have a place. Thankfully, this covers a couple of bases for me. This not only meets my hopeful-sounding goal for the transition to this part of the song, but it will already be in the same key for the music that plays in the overworld. I did, however, add in an additional melody because of the whole 10 fingers thing, and in the end, I have a body of music that departs from negative to positive. Additionally, because of complementary keys, I have my first ever callback to the prelude to close it all out. Without further ado, here is my opening demo. As always, please feel free to leave comments about anything that crosses your mind while watching. Are there certain things I should go into more detail about? Should I stop droning on about other things? Is the music trash? Did I accomplish my goals? If this video was interesting or entertaining to you, please consider subscribing for the next track, Main Theme, also known as the overworld music. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.